They thought they'd left me with nothing. Then I put my father's old card into a machine and watched their whole life start to unravel. They don't tell you how loud a single plastic card can sound in your hand when everything you built is on the line. A door slammed. A bag hit the pavement. My breath wrapped around a trembling card the way winter wraps around bare hands. I remember the sharp sting of the cold metal of the ATM, the fluorescent bank lights buzzing like a bee trapped in glass, and the way his face went white on the other end of the line. In one phone call, the bank froze every account, and the truth spilled out. I'm a mother. I made pancakes with 2 hands and kissed scraped knees and whispered goodnight promises into the dark. I believed our life was ordinary because ordinary is what I wanted for my children. But ordinary can be an elaborate mask. The bills I paid, the calls I took, the smiles I practiced, they were braided into a quiet life that hid cracks. That facade broke the night he told me I had to leave. I'll take you there. I'll take you through the cold morning. I found a single card tucked in my father's old wallet. The numb panic that turned into a plan and every small, desperate step after. You'll see the receipts that didn't match the story he told. You'll hear the voicemail that slid under my door like a final, polite shove. You'll sit in the bank with me as a manager's eyes move from paper to paper, and you'll feel what it's like when someone's secret account is no longer private. You'll hear how one small, desperate move exposed everything he hid, and how I finally got the answer I needed. This isn't just about money or humiliation. It's about proof, about reclaiming a truth that was being rewritten behind my back. It's about showing my children that being pushed out doesn't mean being defeated. If you've ever been backstabbed by those closest to you and fantasized about the perfect revenge, like subscribe and comment your own story below. This one's going to hit hard. A line appears now on the screen. True story. Names changed. Hold on. Chapter 1 starts in 3, 2, 1. Morning smelled like toast and laundry soap. Sunlight poured in through the kitchen window in a steady, lazy beam and landed on the little chaos of our life. A cereal bowl rimmed with milk. A small sock missing its partner. A steam ghost rising from my coffee. My hands moved without thinking, folding a tiny shirt the way my mother taught me, the rhythm a quiet prayer. Fold, fold, fold. My daughter laughed at something I could no longer hear, high and bright, and for a moment I believed everything would be all right. He was always charming when the world could see him. At the school gate, he smiled and waved and said the right things to other parents. At home, things slipped like a seam. I learned to notice the small pulls, the way he answered questions with jokes, the way his eyes slid away when I asked about money. He said it was stress. He said it was temporary. He said, "It's nothing. We'll sort it." I believed him because I wanted to believe him. I wanted simple. I wanted safe. I wanted my kids to go to bed with the same steady house and the same small traditions I had stitched together. My father's voice lived in my head like an old radio, crackly, honest, steady. He'd say things plainly. "Keep your receipts," he'd tell me. "Never trust charm over numbers." He left me small things when he passed. A battered watch, a string of coins, and an old leather wallet tucked with a single worn bank card. I kept that card in a shoebox on the top shelf without thinking, because it felt like a talisman, a piece of a man who taught me to hold my head up and count my days. Neighbors waved over the fence. My friend Rosa brought over soup when my little one had the fever. Everyone assumed the same things I wanted to assume, that our life was ordinary in all its mess. No one saw the quiet edits he made to our story. He moved a bill here, called a payment something else there. I found small things out of place and told myself I'd misread them. I told myself the rhythm would reset. First red flag, a late-night call. I couldn't hear him speak, only the way he bristled when he hung up. A tightness around the jaw that settled like ice. The next morning, he shrugged and lied. "Just business. Don't worry about it." Later, I stood at the sink with a stack of envelopes and felt a coldness slide from my fingers up into my chest. There was a notice with my name on it. Laughter from the kids was a distant soundtrack. The invoice paper felt like a stranger's hand. Thin, clinical, the edges biting my skin. Numbers stared at me in black ink, an amount I didn't recognize, a payment that hadn't cleared. I remember the exact sound of disbelief, not dramatic, not cinematic, just the low, stunned hum in the living room while the television talked about the weather. I read the lines twice, then 3 times. Paper rustled under my palm like the whisper of a secret I had not earned. I felt sick in that way you do when you realize a foundation you trusted is rotting, a hollow in the pit of the stomach, a dry mouth, the sense that the air itself had shifted. We argued in small ways for a while. I kept my sentences short, testing the water. "What is this?" I asked, holding up the paper. He made a face and reached for it as if the words were contagious. "You always do this," he said. "You make mountains out of molehills." He smiled in that way that smoothed the tension for anyone else in the room. He said, "I haven't been hiding anything." He said, "We'll sort it." He sounded tired and patient, like a man who'd been rehearsing this line. My heart, the clumsy, hopeful thing it is, wanted to believe him again. There were other little things, a business trip that extended by one day and then another, vague receipts for consulting that arrived in the mail with my name on them, a check that bounced and then was explained away with a calm, practiced irritation. Each time I pointed to a crack, he would plug it with a smile and a promise, and each time I would patch the hole with my own hands because that is what you do when you are trying to keep a roof over your children's heads. At night, I would lie awake and listen to the house breathe. I played the voice of my father back in my mind until each instruction felt like a pulse. Keep your receipts. Keep your eyes open. The card in the shoebox began to feel less like an object and more like an idea, a possibility tucked into leather. I told myself to be patient. I told myself to gather proof, quietly, like one gathers fruit in a season, without making noise, without showing the birds there's a harvest. Then, a week later, a notification slid across my phone screen like a blade. A transaction alert for an account I didn't know existed. The name attached to it was a set of initials I had never heard. I stared at the tiny letters until they blurred. My first thought was denial. My second was the cold, hard animal thought. Check again. I pulled up the statements, finger trembling. At the bottom of a page, a pattern appeared. Small transfers that matched the dates when he was supposed to be home. Withdrawals that lined up with his late meetings. The more I looked, the less I was willing to breathe. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, paper in hand, and heard his phone vibrate on the dresser. A new voicemail arrived, the preview lighting up the screen. I didn't mean to listen to it. I clicked anyway because at that moment, ignorance was as poisonous as truth. His voice came through, hushed and urgent. A woman's laugh, just the edge of it, threaded under the words. My name was not spoken, but the tone, the casual intimacy, landed like a stone. I pressed my back against the doorframe and slid down until I was sitting on the floor. The kitchen clock ticked without concern. The children played in the next room, unsuspecting. I folded the paper into a smaller square as if that would make the numbers less real. The house was full of ordinary sounds and extraordinary lies. I held the invoice against my chest, and for the first time in a long time, the rhythm of folding shirts didn't keep me steady. I knew then that something bigger was happening. I didn't know the shape of it yet. I only knew the direction, toward a truth I had to find, even if finding it tore everything down. The screen on my phone dimmed. The sound of the voicemail ended. I waited for him to come in and explain, to smooth it over with those practiced words, but the silence was a different kind of answer. Fade to black. Lies. Denials. A door slammed. That's how the night begins in my head. Like a bad loop, I hear the pieces before I see them. His keys on the counter. The rain at the front step. The way the house seemed to shrink around us as if the walls were holding their breath. He came in later than he said he would. He walked like a man who had been practicing his calm all day. The rain made his hair cling to his forehead. Water dotted his coat. The hallway light threw long, thin shadows. Footsteps echoed. He stood in the doorway and looked at me, the way someone inspects a painting that has been damaged. He said, quietly, the words rehearsed, to steady him, "You left me no choice." I remember the exact way those words landed. It sounded like a verdict. I said, "You're throwing me out?" My voice was small in that large, suddenly unfamiliar room. I kept it small because there were still children in the house, because panic makes noise, and I wanted to keep that noise away from them. He smiled the practiced smile and said it again, softer, as if he were explaining something inevitable. "You know why." He didn't raise his hand. He didn't need to. The house felt heavier. The wallpaper looked suddenly busy and accusatory. The rain at the door grew louder, as if the night were applauding him. I grabbed a bag. Just one. The zipper screeched. It was the sound of a life compressing into a single round maw of fabric. I shoved in a toothbrush, my daughter's faded sweater, a single pair of shoes. The smell of old perfume, his, not mine, clung to a shirt I shoved in at the last second. A small plastic toy rolled out and hit the floor with a soft, ridiculous noise. I picked it up and held it like proof that the life inside the house had been ordinary once. My heart moved through stages fast and hard. Shock, disbelief, humiliation. I felt the hot sting of embarrassment that comes when neighbors look up from their newspapers and see your world spilling into the street. I felt anger, bright and immediate, then the slow, hardening kind that builds a plan. I remembered in a flash every time he had dismissed me with a joke or a sigh. I remembered every time I had folded another shirt and pretended the hole it hid didn't exist. I promised my children a home. I would not let him rewrite that promise for them. He took the children to Rosa's across the street while I stood with a bag at my feet like an absurd, improvised suitcase. The neighbor's porch light was a halo. Little feet pounded down the steps, and then there were the small voices, sleepy and unaware, held by Rosa's arms while I tried to keep my hands from shaking. I kissed them both in quick motions that felt like theft. I told them it was a sleepover. I told myself it was temporary. The world smelled of night rain and washing detergent, phone battery at 14%. I called my friend, and the call went straight to voicemail. I called the bank because that felt like water to a thirsty person, something practical, immediate. And the automated voice asked me for a number I didn't know how to give. I couldn't log in. My passwords didn't unlock the accounts. Panic has a way of making everything a microscope. Every little denial is amplified. The cold on my skin turned inward. I sat on the curb and wrapped my coat around me while the rain tried to bring me clean. I tried to text him. No answer. I tried to call my mother's old number to the shoebox of things that carried his voice in my head, but it was only the recorded hum of connection. I called friends who told me to come over, who offered couches and spare rooms, who didn't quite understand why this had happened. I felt foolish accepting help that felt like charity and grateful for it at the same time. I rang the bank again and again. Each time, the line cut me off like a small scythe. Fear came in practical forms. No access to accounts, no money in my pocket. My phone dimmed as if the world were telling me to stop looking. The house keys were in his hand, and not mine. My identity felt unmoored. I sat on a stoop at 2 a.m. and watched steam rise from the gutter. Cars passed with their own heated little worlds inside. People slept. My breath clouded in the cold air. When I finally crawled into my car to sleep on the seat because it felt safer than a stranger's couch, I checked the glove compartment out of a habit that had nothing to do with hope. Fingers moving by muscle memory, I shoved aside a stack of napkins, and there it was. A small soft rectangle of leather worn on the edges. My father's wallet. I had thought it safe, boxed away with the things you don't touch often. Tucked into a slit of leather was the card I had kept like a superstition. The one that said, in ink and imprint, a name that wasn't my husband's and numbers I barely knew. I held the card, and the car hummed around me, the engine ticking as it cooled. The card felt ordinary and profound at once, like finding an anchor in a storm. My hand trembled. It was a strange consolation, like touching a piece of someone who had once taught me to keep my eyes open. I ran my thumb along the embossing. The plastic was cool and certain. That night, under streetlight and rain, the card felt like a choice placed back in my palm. I didn't know what it could do. I only knew it was something he couldn't erase with a smile. My fingers closed around it like a promise. The world blurred around the edges. I pressed the card to my chest and listened to my own heartbeat. For a couple of seconds, I walked into the bank like a woman carrying only a piece of paper and a too heavy pocket of hope. The fluorescent lights hummed above me, steady and indifferent. The teller's screen glowed. My fingers closed around the old card. The plastic was cool and worn where my father's thumb had rubbed it smooth. It felt like a relic and a tool at once. At the self-serve machine, the card slid into the slot with a small mechanical sigh. The machine chewed for a second and then spit out a little paper slip. My hands shook. The sound of the printer was loud in the room, a steady consumer of minutes. I kept my head down because keeping my head down made the world feel smaller and therefore less likely to break apart. I hadn't expected much. Maybe a small withdrawal, cash enough for a motel and 2 breakfasts. Instead, a teller leaned forward, eyes narrowing at her screen. A manager appeared, the soft scrape of his shoes a punctuation. I could feel my face hot under the bank's lighting. He asked me a series of voice-quiet questions. He said they were seeing unusual activity. He said they needed to review the accounts. He used the word freeze, and it landed like an order. They told me the accounts were frozen. There was a moment then where everything condensed into paper and ink. The manager fetched printed statements, photocopies folded like small accusations. He placed them before me the way someone sets down an evidence tray. I sifted through them, as if I could feel the story in the fibers. The bank staff moved around me, polite and efficient, and the room smelled faintly of toner and solution. Machines hummed patiently like indifferent witnesses. Slowly, deliberately, I read. At first it looked like columns of numbers, dates in neat rows, amounts that seemed almost abstract. Then, as my eyes followed the lines, the abstraction became a map. Small transfers, repeated on nights he had said he'd be home. Withdrawals that matched the times he said he'd had meetings. Payments to names that weren't ours. Loans that bore our signature, but I'd never signed. Expenses listed as consulting that paid out to accounts I didn't recognize. Each line was a stitch. Together, they drew a picture I had only half feared. Every lie mapped out in numbers. My breath came short. At first, there was shock, then a slow, hot anger that moved like liquid through my limbs. Betrayal had a voice now, and it was made of numbers and dates and bank codes. The manager spoke in a low voice, more to his computer than to me, about discrepancies, about patterns that didn't match a single household's spending. He said something that felt too big for the room, that it looked like this was more than a personal dispute. When people say the world goes quiet in certain moments, it's because it does. The noise isn't gone. It's just farther away, muffled while your focus sharpens until everything is a single thread. I could hear the soft click of a pen, the distant ring of a phone, the shuffle of paper. I could hear my own pulse. They gave me copies. A neat stack of photocopied pages I could carry like proof or like a burden. I spread them on the counter like someone laying out a map before a voyage. There were transfers to an account name I didn't recognize, payments to a business with a name that looked like a person's initials. ML appeared over and over like a refrain in a sad song. The sight of it tightened something behind my ribs. There was a small, terrible relief in the freeze. For the first time since that door slammed, something outside of him had intervened. The accounts being frozen felt like a hand put on a turning wheel, not the whole victory, but a pause. This ice kept him from shifting more of the story into places I couldn't touch. It brought the hidden ledger into the light. It made the private public in a way that felt both invasive and necessary. But the freeze was also a knife. It didn't fix what was gone. It only stopped the drain long enough for me to see how deep it had been. I remember thinking, in the middle of the hum and the paper, that safety was being negotiated in a tiny bank office while my children slept 2 houses down and didn't know their lives were being audited. I left the bank with a folder under my arm and the weight of the card in my pocket. Outside, the day had thinned into a pale gray. I felt both smaller and bigger at the same time, as if the truth had cut something away and also given me room to stand. Back at Rosa's, I sat on a bench in the kitchen and opened the folder. Page after page, stamps, merchant names. The coffee in the mug cooled. I traced the lines with a fingertip until my skin tingled. Then, an email arrived. One of those machine-generated things the bank sends when an account has been flagged. Attached was a PDF with more detailed entries. I clicked it and scrolled. There it was. Clearer now in digital type, transfers to an account labeled with the initials I had already seen. Transfer to ML. Repeated, month after month. A payroll entry redirected, a loan payout wired in 3 separate increments. The lines vibrated on the screen like a secret that had been rehearsing itself for years. I whispered the initials under my breath to make them real and to taste them, to see if they fit in my mouth. ML. The letters hung there, small and insistently present. I said them again, slower, as if speaking them might pull more threads loose. I didn't know who ML was. I only knew the name had shown up enough times to be part of the pattern. I held the folder to my chest and felt, for the first time since the night he'd closed the door, my spine align with something like resolve. The bank's freeze had bought me something more valuable than cash. Evidence. The room seemed to breathe around me. My hands were steady now, fingers folding the papers into neat stacks. I would trace every line. I would follow every transfer. I would name what had been unnamed. Mel, I whispered, and the syllables were equal parts accusation and question. I spread the photocopies across the kitchen table like a cartographer laying out a map. The lamp above me was dim, a single pool of amber against the night. Paper crinkled when I moved a stack. The keyboard clicked in the next room each time I opened another PDF. My father's card lay on top of a bill like a small, stubborn coin of truth. 0 o'clock. I dialed the lawyer I trusted. Her voice was businesslike and steady over the line. She didn't say, "I'm sorry," the way friends do. She said, "Bring everything." She asked the right questions. She taught me to ask the bank the right questions back. She told me not to sign anything without seeing it. She told me to breathe. Short sentence, breathe. 2 o'clock. I scheduled the meeting with bank compliance. The appointment was a window of time in a sterile office with a polite man who typed slowly and a woman who scanned documents like a judge weighing plates. In that room, the photocopies felt smaller and truer than they had at my kitchen table. They took things seriously. They told me the freeze would buy time. They told me they could trace recipient accounts. They promised cooperation. Their calm was a kind of armor. 6 o'clock. I built a folder. Tabs, dates, receipts, screenshots, a chronology. I labeled each item in my neat, exact hand. I called an old friend who worked in HR at a company down the road. She listened to the pattern and said, "This looks like payroll diversion." I messaged an investigative journalist I'd met at a PTA meeting once. He asked for a summary and said he'd be discreet. I made copies of every statement, every strange invoice, every line that said ML. I printed emails. Flagged times when withdrawals coincided with his meetings, and underlined the loans I'd never agreed to. The house smelled of paper and cold coffee. My children slept 2 doors down. I folded my hands around a mug and read the numbers until the edges blurred. Doubt lived under my ribs like a second heartbeat. What if I'm wrong? What if I misread dates? What if this tears the kid's life apart? Then another line, firmer. He can't get away with this. I made a list of tactical steps and checked them off slowly. Contact bank compliance. Done. Gather witness statements from Rosa and the neighbor who noticed late-night visitors. Tomorrow. Make a meeting with an attorney. Done. Freeze accounts where possible. Initiated. Prepare an exposure plan that would protect my children. Drafted. Think about a safe way to go public. Options sketched on a scrap, pros and cons in short sentences. Social media could be a weapon and a trap. A journalist could be careful or hungry for headlines. I weighed risk against the need for truth. Obstacles arrived like predictable weather. He called. He left messages that sounded like concern. He sent emails that read like apology and assurance. A lawyer's letter arrived the next afternoon, formal and thin, asking me to stop sharing documents. The words on the page were polite threats dressed in legal language. I read them under the lamp and felt something cold slide down my spine. Someone else had brought a file to the table. He was not going to fold quietly. He tried to gaslight. He texted a dozen little doubts I'd had back at me, wrapped as questions. He asked whether I was sure about the dates. He suggested I might be misremembering. He hinted that if I wanted access to the accounts again, I should be reasonable. He used the language of bargaining. It was an old trick, make the accused look unsteady while the accuser looks reasonable. My doubt came back for a hungry visit. Short sentences. I pushed them away. I called Rosa and asked if she would be willing to give a statement about the nights she saw him leave. She said yes, without hesitation, and the steadiness of her voice made a small room in my chest feel less empty. The neighbor who ran the corner shop confirmed a pattern. He kept a log on napkins and handed me a smudged receipt that matched a withdrawal date. Small allies, quiet evidence. At night, I rehearsed what I would say. In the mirror, my face was tired but clear. I imagined presenting the folder to the bank, to a journalist, to an assembly of people who could make the truth move. I imagined his face when the ledger spoke. I imagined my children knowing that their mother had chosen the harder, truer path. Short setbacks arrived too. A bank clerk misplaced a page, and I waited a worrying week for a reprint. An email I sent to a journalist got no reply. A friend suggested I should accept a temporary settlement to avoid public drama. The idea of silence made my skin crawl. Each delay was a test of patience and resolve. I learned to move like water around obstacles, not against them. My internal voice sharpened. What if I'm wrong became, what if I'm right? What if I'm right and no one believes me became, then I will make them believe with proof. He can't get away with this became he will not get away with this on my watch. Short sentences, a sharpening. I planned the exposure in layers. First, ensure the bank's compliance team had everything to build a case. Second, secure legal protection for me and the children, restraining options, custody basics, a safety plan. Third, gather community witnesses and documented timelines. Fourth, prepare a measured public release. A concise post with scans, with dates, with nothing that could be twisted into libel, timed to launch only after legal counsel gave the nod. Fifth, be ready for backlash. Prepare support contacts, temporary housing, phone safety. Each step had logistics attached. Names, numbers, windows. There were practical rehearsals. I drafted concise statements. I stored copies of documents in cloud folders with two-step verification. I made emergency bags by the door and charged a second phone. I counted the kids' favorite snacks and packed an extra. My plans were full of small human things. This struggle was for their lives, not for any trophy. The days moved like scenes edited tight. I met with bank compliance in a room with gray carpet and a fish tank that did nothing to lighten the mood. They listened. They nodded. They agreed to subpoena certain records. The lawyer filed preliminary motions to protect assets and to request expedited document production. An investigative journalist asked for a sit-down. Rosa prepared a short statement about what she'd seen. Each piece clicked into place like a machine warming up. Then, just when I allowed myself a small sense of forward motion, a message arrived. It was terse, formal, and attached was a PDF that smelled of other people's money and other people's counsel. The file said that if I continued to share documents or contact certain parties, legal action would be pursued. It closed with the kind of sentence that sounds like a threat wrapped in polite paper. I stared at the page. The kitchen lamp hummed. My hands were steady. My chest was a drum. For a moment, the old doubt tried to creep back in. Maybe this was too big. Maybe the cost would be more than I could bear. Then I thought of the little faces I had kissed at Rosa's house, the way my daughter's hair smelled like shampoo and sugar. I put the lawyer's letter aside and opened a new document. I had one last move planned. It was careful, layered, and it did not depend on spectacle. It did not rely on chance. It relied on what I already had: receipts, dates, witnesses, a bank that had frozen accounts, and a stubborn refusal to be erased. I pressed my palms against the cool table and whispered to the night, not a prayer, but a promise. My children were asleep and would wake to a different morning. I would make sure it was for the better. The phone buzzed again. I looked at the screen. It was a voicemail from him. I hit play with fingers that did not shake. The voice on the message was low. It sounded like an attempt at reason and an attempt at intimidation at the same time. He asked me to stop. He asked me to be reasonable. He said there would be consequences for anyone who took this public. I let the message play through twice. I listened, not for his words, but for the edges, the breathing, the timing, the spaces where certainty cracked. I saved the file. I hit record on my own device. I put that recording in a folder labeled with the date. Short sentence. I was ready. I counted the breaths before I walked into the room where everything would happen. It is a small, strange superstition. Breath as ballast. I had rehearsed the order of things so many times it felt like prayer. Present the bank records, meet with the journalist, post only what my lawyer approved, then, if necessary, stand where he could not pretend ignorance. The night had been a series of careful steps. Now the steps led to a room full of faces and a folder that smelled faintly of toner and justice. We started at the bank. The compliance officer sat across from me behind a thin glass shield, the fish tank humming in the background like a mechanical heart. He read the ledger aloud, every line precise and deliberate. Dates, amounts, recipients. Each syllable landed in the room and made the air heavier, as if truth had weight. The journalist sat to my left, hands folded, eyes sharp. I watched the way the manager's eyebrows rose the second the account names matched the prints in my folder. The ledger was not elegant. It was arithmetic and habit. It told a story no one had told me in words. Then we went public in the quietest possible way. We shared the evidence with someone who knew how to tell stories that would stick. An article with copies of statements. An interview edited tight and careful. The journalist's voice was calm, clinical even, which made the facts land harder. Where I feared sensationalism, he gave clarity. These were documents, dates, and signatures, not accusations born of anger. A live post followed, nothing extraneous, just scanned pages, a timeline, a firm statement. I was seeking answers and accountability. Across town, the phone in my ex-husband's hand vibrated. In the room with him, people shifted. Colleagues who had once laughed at his jokes went pale. A fork clinked against a plate somewhere, as if a soundtrack had been set to slow motion. I watched him through the window of unfolding events, the way his jaw slackened, the way his practiced calm unspooled into something thin and flustered. He tried to speak. The sound of his words was thin when the ledger's voice had already begun. He tried to explain. He stumbled on dates. His voice hit the signatures and faltered. He watched everything he'd hidden be shut down, his carefully kept story collapsing like a house of cards in slow motion. There is a peculiar sound when a life you've known breaks its pattern, a sudden hush. Then the small noises of people finding their footing. Neighbors peered out and read the article on their phones. Messages began to appear, some with anger, some with sympathy, many with stunned silence. The social fallout was swift. People who had trusted him began to call their own banks, to ask questions quietly. At the bank, a legal notice was drafted. The freeze that had paused the flow became the first step toward formal action. Papers moved from desk to desk. A judge's name was typed into a file. I watched the machinery of accountability begin to turn. And yet, when the final confirmation came, when the bank verified the freeze and a lawyer told me, softly, that motions had been filed, what I felt was not triumph so much as an unspooling relief. I sat on the edge of a plastic chair in a waiting room and laughed, a short, wet sound that surprised me. Tears came afterward, uninvited and honest, wet and warm because grief and relief live in the same room. I didn't feel triumphant the way I thought. I felt free, I told myself aloud, and the words tasted like something I'd earned. There were practical consequences that followed like dominoes. The bank confirmed assets were frozen pending investigation. Legal actions were initiated, motions to secure funds, requests for expedited records, the beginning of a custody conversation that would protect my children. Help arrived in forms I hadn't expected. Rosa with casseroles and offers of a spare room. A cousin who had a friend in housing services who could guide me through temporary arrangements. People reached out with offers that felt like a soft net beneath the edges of my life. The hardest part was the quiet that came after the storm. I walked slowly past our old house the day after the article ran. It looked smaller than memory, a place of familiar windows that now held the ghost of what had been. I stood some distance away and remembered the mornings. Sunlight on cereal bowls, chopped apples, the way my daughter used to braid her own hair while humming. I let myself feel the losses, the promises that had been broken, the afternoons of pretending not to hear when explanations fell flat. I let myself name the gains, too, the truth, the regained dignity, the safety measures that would be set in place for my children. Memory is a theater where both sorrow and gratitude have seats. When the initial legal rush slowed into a steadier, more bureaucratic pace, I handed a fat file to an ally, a woman from the bank who had stayed late to ensure every line was tracked, who had become unexpectedly personal in her care. The paper made a soft slap as it landed in her hands. She looked up at me, and there was a brief, private smile between us. Part exhaustion, part recognition. I pressed my fingers against the folder and felt the letters of a future I had not chosen but would claim. This is not the end. It's the beginning, I said, and the sentence fit like a key. It was neither boast nor threat. It was a map. We would move through forms, through hearings, through quiet days of rebuilding. There would be small practical triumphs, a bank confirmation here, a hearing scheduled there, children whose Sunday mornings slowly returned to ordinary rhythms. There would be hard conversations and there would be laughter. There would be bills and phone calls and the mundane arithmetic of a life rebuilt. We left the room then. The light outside was soft, forgiving. I folded the edges of the folder inward like tucking a blanket around something newly warm. The road ahead was long and I would walk it with patience and a steady, uncompromising hand. When I look back now, the story doesn't feel like a straight line. It feels like a series of rooms I had to walk through without knowing what waited on the other side. There was the room of betrayal, where the floor dropped out from under me and I learned how quiet lies can be. There was the room of fear, where cold nights and unanswered calls made me question my own footing. Then came the room of strategy, where paper, patience, and allies mattered more than shouting ever could. And finally, the room of exposure, where the truth stood on its own and didn't need my anger to hold it up. The relief that followed was complicated. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired in a deep way, the kind that comes from carrying a secret too long. I felt lighter, too. Dignity, I learned, isn't loud. It's a calm that arrives when you stop bargaining with someone else's dishonesty. Silence has a cost, and I had been paying it for years without realizing the interest was compounding. Speaking up was expensive in its own way, but it stopped the bleeding. If there's anything I want you to take from this, it's this. Document everything. Keep copies. Take notes while your hands are steady. Trust numbers over charm. Seek help early, from your bank, from legal counsel, from people who know how systems actually work. Choose allies carefully. The right ones won't push you toward spectacle. They'll push you toward clarity. And above all, prioritize safety. Yours and your children's. No truth is worth risking the people you love. Boundaries aren't punishments. They're definitions. They tell the world where you end and where respect must begin. Self-respect isn't stubbornness. It's the quiet refusal to accept a story that erases you. I learned that protecting my children didn't mean hiding the truth from them forever. It meant modeling how to face it with care and courage, how to choose a longer road that leads somewhere solid. I close the file now. The paper makes a soft, final sound. Outside, the street is bright, and somewhere just out of frame, I can hear my children laughing, their voices loose and unafraid. I step toward the light with the ordinary confidence of someone who knows the ground beneath her feet again. If this revenge saga gave you that rush of justice, smash like, subscribe for more epic tales, and share your revenge story in the comments. Click the next video box for another one. Truth speaks, even when you're pushed out.